and welcome to Community Policy Speaks. I'm really excited to welcome you all. I'm Samiha Rafiq, researcher at Community Policy Forum. This is the podcast where we dive deep into the issues that matter most to Muslim communities. From education and social justice to culture and politics, we bring you thought-provoking discussions with insightful guests, experts, and changemakers who are passionate about making a difference. Community Policy Forum is an independent think tank seeking to promote evidence-based and community-centered approaches to policymaking surrounding the structural inequalities facing Muslim communities in the UK. We attempt this through connecting policymakers with academic research and experts, and through providing platforms for engagement with diverse Muslim voices on areas of contemporary importance. Today, we are going to be looking into the critical issues facing Muslim women in public life. In today's world, many women encounter barriers, but for Muslim women, these challenges are compounded by the intersections of race, religion, and gender. So in this podcast, we'll be taking a look at the structural obstacles Muslim women face, particularly how gendered Islamophobia affects them in public spaces. So this is part 2 of our discussion. So if you haven't yet heard part 1, head over to our YouTube channel, where part 1 is there for your listening. Without giving too much away, we will be asking tough questions on what policies and practices exacerbate these issues, and how do intersectional factors shape these experiences, and most importantly, what can be done to dismantle these systemic barriers. I have with me Suhaiymah Manzoor-Khan, who is a writer, poet, and educator disrupting understandings of history, race, knowledge, and violence. She works to equip herself and others with the tools and faith to resist the unlivable conditions we find ourselves in and work towards another reality. So, Suhaiymah, thank you so much for coming on board. It's really wonderful, and I'm really excited to have you here with us.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here.
So part 1, we discussed more from an academic policy perspective, and whilst we'll be touching upon those things today as well, Suhaiymah's going to be giving us more experience from and exposure from her background in more creative industry. So I'm really looking forward to having that angle to this conversation. I'm going to start off with something very, not simple, but kind of straightforward, and just asking you, how do you think intersectional factors have really compounded your experiences?
Okay, so Bismillah. I think for some context, just so people kind of understand what perspective I'm speaking from, my kind of work in a public-facing role has primarily been through poetry, spoken word poetry, so I kind of gained a platform through that. And then I've sort of published a poetry collection, so there's kind of that element, and then more of like non-fiction work, so looking at Islamophobia, and then a more prose poetry work. And a lot of my work involves doing workshops that are participatory, creative, often geared at creative writing and poetry, and likewise, or otherwise workshops that are more educational. So that's just the background through which I guess I'll answer that question in terms of how intersectional factors have impacted or shaped my experience. I suppose the way that I think about it is that structural conditions are to do with what is the underlying foundations that has set up society that we live in, and how those underlying conditions or foundations or theories or ideas inform and are embedded and baked into the institutions we interact with. So for me, as a Muslim woman, interacting with institutions in that society, and primarily, let's say, artistic, creative, cultural, and academic institutions, educational institutions, how that impacts my experience is the question that, I guess, just to break it down. So I would say that, obviously as a Muslim, just in general, there's the first kind of frontier of obvious experiential barrier, I suppose, is that of white supremacy. What does it mean for the society that we live in to be founded upon colonial, but I'm talking about Britain primarily here, so British colonial white supremacy. That means that there's material reality to that. So it means that a lot of the institutions that we interact with, so as a poet, often, and especially in the last year, I've done a lot of work with, for example, museums, And a lot of them have these really problematic histories in terms of their archives, but also in terms of the very foundation of that building is built from slave money, is built from the endowments of cotton traders, is built from the wealth and the philanthropy of people who benefited from colonial trade or colonial investments, or in fact the buying and selling of human beings. And so, even just on a material level, you can see how immediately we're confronted by white supremacy in interacting with these places and spaces. But then, ideologically, of course, how white supremacy and colonialism shapes the ideas and the premises that these institutions work from. So we know that for most and any racialized people in this country, those kind of foundations exacerbate and lead to problems. For example, you have the small scale, I suppose, of that, which is, stereotypes that people face in terms of racist stereotypes and Orientalist stereotypes, and they can be like, they can be seemingly quote unquote positive in terms of kind of this fascination or curiosity to do with people of color, but they oftentimes are much more harmful and obviously exclude you or make you feel othered. But I think here is where obviously it becomes very clear that gender, being a woman and being obviously a visible Muslim woman, immediately impacts my experience of that racism, because rather than, for example, being stopped and searched as I enter a museum, which may be a more masculine gendered experience of Islamophobia, whereby I would be read as a threat immediately. The way in which I'm read as a threat is less so in this kind of overt aggressor, but more so in this kind of I would say a way that's focused on the ideological, so focused on the ideas that I might articulate and come out with. And so to give you some now concrete examples of what I'm talking about here, as a writer, there's a real focus on the work, the content of your work, and what you put into the things that you write. And so what I would say from the perspective of like cultural institutions, artistic institutions, and education institutions is that we begin to see what their priorities and investments are that underlie them when we see what they do and don't condone. So, for example, and I'm going to try and give you maybe 2 or 3 concrete examples. I've been invited to share my poetry in school settings, right? So come, please share your poetry. And the perspective there is one which is, I mean, we can talk about the negative and positive here, but the idea would be we want to show a Muslim woman to our young people, who are a lot of them Muslim girls, who is, let's say, in their eyes, confident, outspoken, blah blah blah, articulate. So this is what they kind of offer, the suggested offer. But then when I'm invited to this school, I was told also at the same time, please can you not do any poems that are explicitly political, right? So now there's this clash between wanting me as the tokenistic body through which you can create a narrative that defies your expectations about Muslim women. So, for example, they don't speak, they're not confident, they can't articulate themselves. So we'll show that you do these things, but if you say the things you want to say and you actually articulate your own political views, or perhaps your critiques about the state we live in, your critiques about any of the systems, or indeed the racism we've talked about, the colonialism we've talked about, that's too far. So what we find there then is where you have that Islamophobia that we mentioned, this view of Muslims as threatening, as security issues, as potentially criminal, or at least radicalizing of others. And remember, with Muslim women, it's more so the latter, that we radicalize. Whether it's our children, which it usually is. And so in the context of a school, you kind of see that firsthand, that you can't come in with these ideas that may turn people towards that which is extreme. And so it comes through this guise of kind of like, enthusiastic confidence building, but it ends up being articulated as a type of policing and censorship. I mean, yeah, I've already spoken quite a lot, but I can give another example if that feels useful.
No, I think that last example you gave is really eye-opening because it's like it's really bittersweet. It's that excitement of being or called to something and then being told how to do it. Like, they trust you enough to come but don't trust you fully to do what they need you to do. So it's very I guess it's quite difficult in that sense. Thank you so much. I feel like that was a really comprehensive understanding, I suppose, of how, things like race, religion, gender can impact you in your area of work. Um, and I think you've already answered my next question as well, in the sense, how does gendered Islamophobia do that? But what do you think are some of the pre-existing policies or practices that really exacerbate this in the world we are in now, especially coming out of the kind of government that we had, and sort of coming into something else? How do you think that they impact?
No, that's a great question. And I think here I'll probably split it between like domestic policies and international policies. But I think both, because I think both impact Muslim women, because the way we're perceived, unfortunately, we're always tied into international events at the same time as being scrutinized domestically. So I would say for Muslim women, like there's obviously a lot of like prior historical factors that we mustn't forget about. And mentioned colonialism, etc. But even from the immigration acts we have in the early 70s, even the what did they call them, where they would essentially do these really invasive checks on especially South Asian women at the border, to check that they weren't lying about their marital status when they enter this country. Yeah, so we have this history. I suppose what I'm trying to say is we have this history of kind of objectifying, violating, and surveilling Muslim women. But I think policies in the more immediate recent years, obviously post 9/11, ones that come to my mind and I think are relevant for this conversation are things like, so from the early 2000s, what I find really interesting is you have this split in the counter extremism, counter terror funding. And so you have a lot that goes obviously through the Home Office, but you also have funding that goes through the Department for Communities and Local Government. And what's really interesting there is that that money, so this is all ostensibly money that is to stop people becoming violent in the future, which we obviously know is already a problematic premise. But a lot of that money gets channeled in a really gendered way. So, for example, let's look at a school again, because again, this is somewhere I spend a lot of time. Um, Boys and young men often would be deemed more as threats to be policed through, for example, prevent, which later we know becomes a statutory policy, or perhaps they'd be excluded or monitored in those ways. Whereas girls, Muslim girls, they, because of the way that gender Islamophobia perceives us, we're perceived to be in need of saving from this backwards, barbaric, patriarchal, violent culture, and at the same time in need of co-opting. So they need to essentially reprogram our minds so that we don't radicalize the next generation of children that we as girls who will become women will raise. So through the Department of Local Government and Communities, you had this funding that went into things like Muslim girls leadership programs. You had Muslim women kind of this roadshow where it was all about kind of building confidence. I know myself, if I look back on my childhood at school, I kind of got a lot of these opportunities that are really strange outcomes of Islamophobic thinking and securitization. So I think they set some really interesting precedents there, in the sense that you can see how, when it comes to Muslim women, then there's this idea that we always need to be co-opted. And so that's where you get, in my example from earlier, we want your body, we want to like use you to tell a narrative we want to tell, but not to tell your narrative. And indeed, I think we've seen in this past year of the genocide in Gaza, this kind of this becomes really difficult now, because so many Muslims and Muslim women, visibly, this is a huge issue for us. This is something people want to talk about, the international politics that we are attached to and we're associated with by our hijabs and our abayas and our dress and our names. But when we do speak, this is seen as not acceptable. And I think another really important one for women in particular is, I think it was David Cameron's government issuing this. I don't believe it became a policy, but it was at least an idea that was mentioned, which was around the fact that Muslim women needed to learn English, and that this is one of the factors for the radicalization and the joining of ISIS. In fact, I think is what David Cameron said in his speech, that that people were joining ISIS because their mothers, for example, couldn't speak English. And this was at the same time as having cut loads of English as an additional language funding, I think
Okay.
millions. Uh, I think that's an interesting example of an antecedent of a policy, because what this kind of set in motion, or perhaps maybe reaffirmed, was the idea that the speech of Muslim women is simultaneously a radicalizing factor, something really significant and controlling and determining of the future of young people in this country, the future generation. But at the
Yeah.
same time, that there's the languages that we might speak as diaspora communities, immigrant communities,
Right.
is in of itself something that requires policing. And what I find interesting in the creative industry is that there's this real fetishization of other languages, of like bring your whole self to it, let's throw in some Arabic words, let's throw in some Urdu words, let's have your Bahari, let's have your Pashto. But at the same time, that's what makes you threatening. So I think these contradictions really shape both the arts world and also like the experiences of particularly women. And then you have the obvious things like prevent and the association of the things that we wear, the languages we speak, and the names that we have with security, with threat. And I think I would also add just generally secularism. This is not a policy, obviously. This is kind of like the world that's been built
Yeah.
in the light of colonial white supremacy. But that also meaning that we're not legible, and lots of times the things that we're trying to articulate or we say or we do, our motivations for things, are not seen. And so I think this is why you have this perennial kind of question around the hijab and why do you wear it and should you be in a
Mm.
public space and can you shake hands and can you not shake hands? All of these questions around the physical um, material being of being a Muslim woman, I think a lot of that is because of this lack of it's essentially there's no meeting in the middle here because secularism refuses to see the things that motivate us and refuses to see them as real intellectual or legitimate. So I think there's so many things that could be mentioned, obviously, but they're ones that I think are interesting for me.
Okay, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. And I'm learning so many new things. Like I didn't realize that, women were forced to have undergo very intrusive checks at border control, or that David Cameron thought, Muslim women needed to learn language because he felt that was connected to some sort of, grooming or kind of falling towards extremism. And it just baffles my mind. They don't know anything about us, do they? Like they don't. Um the last time I asked this question, my guests were kind of like, no, you cannot ask that without a caveat. And it was the idea of what are some of examples of successful policies or practices from around the world that have effectively addressed the challenges by Muslim women in public life. And they were like, there isn't really such a thing. It's more like a wish list of things that we would like to see happening or, that we hope will happen. So I'm going to ask you from the same like angle. What's some things you would put on a wish list of potentially successful policies that you think will help us Muslim women in public life?
Yeah, I think that I'd like to hope that somewhere in the world there are some successful ones that we just, the limits of my knowledge don't know about. I think there's a combination of ways to answer this question, and one is that a lot of the things that would address the challenges or whatever issues that Muslim women face is just addressing those issues that generally affect working class people, that affect communities of color, that affect, addressing racism, addressing capitalism, addressing um, the lack of social care infrastructure in this country. Like if you think about it, a lot of the issues, quote unquote, Muslim women face are because they're intersectional, they relate to all of these common experiences of people of actually who share different identities with us. Then I think with the specific experience of Muslim women, I suppose the question is what I suppose there's two questions here. One is like, are policymakers the ones able to determine our experiences? And I think the reason I raise that is that we have to ask the question, what currently shapes our experiences the most? Is it policies? Well, I've just mentioned there are a few, yes, but these policies oftentimes come about because they have beneficiaries. So my book Tangled in Terror, where I explore kind of Islamophobia, one of the things I'm really interested in is what's the root cause of Islamophobia? Because if you look at the root, you're able to quickly determine who the beneficiaries of Islamophobia are. And so when it comes to Muslim women's experiences, what I'm really keen for us to just emphasize here is that it's not just through kind of accident, ignorance, contradiction, or like you mentioned, they just don't know us. It's unfortunately that's not the only reason that gendered Islamophobia exists. It's actually much more sinister in the sense that you have concerted efforts whereby, for example, a think tank, a right-wing neoconservative think tank, is approached to produce research, paid by the Home Office. I'm talking about the Henry Jackson Society. I'm talking about your kind of neocons to produce research that then undergirds policies like prevent, like counter-extremism, but that's important because what it tells us is there's an investment here, there's an interest in funding policies directly. And so I think we have to be careful about thinking about policy as this thing that is just kind of made in a context where people want the best for society or to address structural challenges. And so I suppose I raise that to say, for example, even if we had a policy, right, and because oftentimes I think sometimes we come up with policies that are about harm reduction, right? So maybe I've heard people talk about like we need more reporting of Islamophobia, or we need more methods of kind of dealing with Islamophobia. Sure, but that's not actually addressing the Islamophobia prior to the fact of it happening. It's addressing it after the fact of it happening. And so my question is, how do we actually, at the root, address the fact that this society needs Islamophobia? It relies on the narrative that Muslims are violent, threatening others, because this allows it to build security infrastructure because you have this ever-threatening other who we have to kind of defend against. And you can see the recent election is really built on this ever-threatening other that we must defend against. You have the riots built again on this narrative. Even the way that the policing of Palestine, pro-Palestine protests, is all kind of about this other and their benefit that they provide to a state that wants to securitize. So I suppose I'm just caveating heavily my answer to this because I think that a wish list has to go sort of beyond policymakers and has to kind of address at the root. For example, if you think about the experiences of Muslim women in public life, I think the current genocide in Gaza, again, we cannot look away from. And so ending the arms trade and the arms deals that this government have with Israeli state, for example, and other states across the world that are, tyrannical and violent, would be a beneficial policy for Muslim women. Why? Because you're disrupting the actual material chain that connects those who need the ideology that Muslims need saving, Muslim women need saving, Muslim men are violent, and all those things that underpin how we're understanding Palestine right now, and why we allow and the world is okay with that genocide happening, and also attaches it to the material reason that ideology exists, which is to allow for the genocide, to allow for colonial expansion, to allow for those arms deals and trades to happen. And so I think we also, it's not the first thing that would come to mind that, oh, ending, or embargoing arms trades would directly materially impact Muslim women's lives, but I think it would because we, in turn, when I go to a school and are told, you can't do a poem about Palestine or a protest poem, that's directly related to those things. So I think it's about being imaginative on a deeper scale and actually addressing the material, by which I mean financial, who really benefits, whose pockets are lined by Islamophobia. And it is oftentimes those arms dealers. It's also things like, deportation planes and prisons in this country. Muslim women, I am part of a co-founder of a collective called the Nejma Collective, and we support Muslims in prison. We work with Muslim women, and there's a huge rate of Muslim women in prison because so many people, mashallah, take their shahada, become Muslim in prison. What that means then is that the issues that Muslim women face aren't always the first things that come to mind, because actually I would say that decarceration is a really big issue that would benefit Muslim women if we said that people who are in prison for non-violent crimes, people who have been criminalized for being poor, being criminalized for being in foster care, being criminalized for being single mothers or being in abusive relationships with them, which actually, if you look at the data, the majority of women in prison are there for these kinds of things. Them being decarcerated, being able to have access to social care, a proper probation service or no probation service, all these things would benefit Muslim women. So I find it hard to actually even articulate a wish list because it's just like a transformation of society from its foundations upwards, including the international, the border, and the domestic. That I think is the only way really to then eventually get to those things that are really specific to us in terms of I don't know, if there's things that I would love to have a place to pray everywhere that I go. Do you know what I mean? Like there's all these other ways that I want to be made safe on a day-to-day level, but to even get to that level where I'd feel safe enough to do those things, it requires this huge historical upheaval, I think.
Thank you so much. And I really love how you mentioned disrupting sort of that material chain, and we don't really think about it from that perspective. So I feel like that was really, really refreshing. Thank you so much. Um, just moving on from that, what do you think, or what are your sort of key recommendations for policymakers to ensure that the needs of Muslims and the rights of Muslim women are adequately addressed in public service and other sectors? And I think you said they have this idea that Muslim women need saving, or that idea of like, we need to sort of be liberated, etc. Um, do you think that feeds into any kind of sort of perspective that they'll ever take on Muslim women? as
Yeah,
well?
I think it does. I mean, if you think about, I mean, you don't need to think about it because it's your job, but but I mean, essentially what policy making relies on is this research, right? And so I think when you're asking that question about key recommendations to ensure that the needs and rights of Muslim women are addressed, the first thing that it relies on is obviously actually speaking to Muslim women and attaining knowledge of Muslim women's experiences. And I think what we find, and we kind of alluded to this earlier, is because there is this tokenization and co-option of Muslim women, often you'll come across research or you'll come across, governmentarians who will say, we did talk to Muslim women. But the groups of Muslim women are very, hand-picked essentially to, again, come up with a certain narrative. You have this after 7/7. This is like well documented now that the Foreign Office, policymakers, they all went to Muslim communities at a large scale en masse and kind of said, what do you think we could do to address the kind of use of violence by people who are unhappy with foreign policy in the UK, which is what was articulated by the 7/7 bombers. And the overwhelming response from the Muslims that they approached was, you need to change British foreign policy. Western foreign policy is the cause that this violence, when articulated, is responding to. But this did not meet the needs of the government, right? The Foreign Office do not, that's not something they can do. They can't just change their foreign policy on the whim of a community that don't like it. And so instead of going with what the majority of those asked wanted and letting that inform policy, they kind of handpicked, right, those Muslim spokespeople who would say, no, 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 it's not foreign policy. We have backwardness amongst ourselves. There's patriarchs in our culture. We're just, some people, they're just really uneducated. And you made a whole host of other things that, oh, they need to learn English. That's where you get these really random policies coming from, right? Essentialist policies. So my answer to this question would be actually listening to Muslim women, listening to a wide range of Muslim women, listening to the variety of experiences of Muslim women, because also it's about, not treating Muslim women as this one single block. Because the reality is there isn't going to be one set, there's going to be so many policies, like I alluded to earlier, that will affect a whole range of Muslim women. So I think with policymakers, it's the recognition, A, that you do not know the needs of Muslim women until you talk to them, and B, you do not know the needs of all Muslim women once you've talked to a few. And I think there has to be space for policymakers also to be willing to feel very uncomfortable, because I think for there to be real change, you have to hear that what you're currently doing is heavily critiqued, heavily criticized. People, it's not working for people, and all of that. And I think oftentimes because of bureaucracy, because of political reasons, I suppose that's not something people want to hear. And also, I think, like you mentioned at the beginning and how you framed the question, there's this idea that policymakers are saving and helping Muslim women because we're always victims, we're always kind of in need of help. And so any policy that relates to us, we should be grateful for and we should be kind of clamoring at. And I think that creates a really difficult situation whereby anything that Muslim women articulate as a demand is seen as demanding. That this is really, you're going too far, you're asking too much. Did we not give you housing in this country? Did we not give you rights? Did we not make Islamophobia a hate crime? Do we not tell you that? But all of those things, I wonder, have they come directly from the mouth of the majority of Muslim women, or have they come from these kind of siloed, um, green ticked parts of community that are given voice in those circles? I think the majority of Muslim women I know, none of them would ever be asked to participate in the kind of research that feeds into kind of parliamentary decisions or policy. So yeah, I think it's that, like, the work prior to the making of the policy where that would be the obvious recommendation.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much. I also want to touch upon how organizations and institutions can proactively, dismantle sort of the systemic barriers that impact Muslim women. Um, and I'm not going to exclude Muslim organizations from this because even if you are a Muslim organization, you can still kind of embody those, those cha barriers, I suppose, to the Muslim women working in those organizations. So, like, just, what would your take be on that?
Yeah, it's a tricky question because, again, I think there's so many things you could say here. I think working to dismantle systemic barriers, firstly, you have to understand them. And I think, unfortunately, so many organizations and institutions don't, right? Like, I always find it interesting that you had that Macpherson definition of institutional racism in the police. This is from the 1990s. And even though you could say that's a limited definition, I'll often bring that definition up when I talk to institutions and organizations in terms of saying, look, this is a definition which talks about the processes of your institution, the norms, the decisions that are made, and how they uphold, sorry, implicit, I'm not saying it's conscious, but perhaps subconscious, inbuilt, let's say ingrained ideals and ideas and perceptions and stereotypes. And so I think loads of institutions don't even have that understanding in the first place of like what it means for them to systemically exclude or systemically. And so I think that's actually interesting what you mentioned about even Muslim organizations. I think if there was a general understanding of what it means that the processes we built, be they good, bad, well-intentioned or not, they have they have processes and they have norms and they have things within them that will generally uphold or kind of exclude, so uphold something or exclude someone. And so I think the first level I would really encourage any organization institution needs to have that thorough understanding first off, and then it's about I think like a review of what does our current process work like, who's holding power in this institution or this organization, and how has that transpired? What are the processes we use to hire and recruit? If you think about it, the majority of organizations is generally the same, right? Which makes you think that there is a pattern here in the sense that you're going to find people of color at a certain tier, but you're going to find power holders at a certain position. You're going to then find women of color even lower down in more precarious positions with less pay, with less opportunity, all of that. So I think we're at a stage where it's kind of not a case that um, I think organizations just need to be really honest with themselves. And unfortunately, I think a lot of times people don't want to give up power because what this will require is that you do give up some power and that you do open up and expand, for example, recruitment, or that you do give opportunities to people that are going to be uncomfortably critique things that are going on in the organization. It also might require some introduction of completely new norms. And I think that's really uncomfortable to traditional structures. I think particularly when it comes to women, there's so many exciting ways that working in organizations and institutions could be changed if we take into account factors like childcare, or the factors like domestic kind of life, or the kinds of things that often are seen as burdens that are gendered upon women. Instead, if we were to like restructure work or institutions, organizations around that, what would that look like? So I think it's about a holistic kind of shift. Sorry, I'm being a little bit ambiguous, but I think it's because it really first requires organizations to understand how they're excluding or like marginalizing Muslim women. And it's not going to be always in a really obvious way. And I think that's the problem. People want
Yeah,
it to be something really obvious that, oh, our policy says we hate Muslim women. It's not
right.
going to be that. So I think it's being a bit more imaginative. And again, talking and like having a clear, transparent process of um, feedback, I suppose, to understand, and listening, because I think one of the other things is so many people I know, you bring a complaint, you go with an issue, you go with a critique, and it's rather than being met with, oh my gosh, this is exactly what we were looking for, thank you, I knew something was wrong in the process. It's met with, no, 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 like we need to stamp this out, we need to shut this down. Either that didn't happen, we don't believe you, or if it did happen, we're just going to simply, um, smack someone on the back and then that's the end of the issue. So I think there's a general misunderstanding, but there's also then just a punitive response either to the person or to the perpetrator. But that's not going to deal with the root issue. Once again, we're dealing with harm after the fact. So it's about, yeah, creating really robust processes from the get-go and then being continuously in a state of reflection.
I think it's really interesting you mentioned sort of this invisible burden that Muslim women have when they go to work that are not entirely understood by the organizations or the institutions that they work for. For example, having a meeting at like 4 o'clock when they have to, in fact, go pick their kids up from school, or just things like that, they don't really take into consideration but are considered. So I'm really glad that you mentioned the idea of like childcare or sort of, domestic responsibilities, because those things are not factored in, but
Mhm.
those things really do impact Muslim women,
100%.
and so or women in general, I guess.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm really glad that you mentioned that.
No, of course. I think it is one of those hidden kind of systemic
Yeah,
things that just exist. And it's, I think, working class women in general, I would say, if you can't afford a nanny to look after your kids, and
exactly.
you can't afford, then it is just going to be part and parcel of your experience. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, unless we want to address on a larger scale and create an entire new society whereby actually this is not just a gendered thing that like so many women will be the main caregivers and care providers, we're not going to address that. So then, well, let's address then what you can do. So totally, I think it's something that's it's essential.
Thank you so much. That really sadly brings us to the end. It's been such a wonderful conversation, and I feel like we've given such a different angle, important but different angle to this conversation.
Oh,
And so
good.
I'm really grateful that we've been able to explore the things that we have. Thank you so much for coming on board, Suhaiymah,
No
and
worries. Thank you for
really
having me.
No, and I think you really tackled the questions really well as well. And that is also the end of our podcast exploring Muslim women in public life and the challenges that they face. So I'm really glad that we were able to end it with hearing your thoughts. Stay tuned for more podcasts coming up. But from me, Samiha, thank you so much for listening. And we'll be back to our usual host, Kazim. And yeah, thank you so much for listening, guys. And you can follow us on our Instagram and Twitter and stay up to date with our work. Thank you so much.